And now we welcome to the studio Professor Teivo Teivainen, Professor of World Politics at the University of Helsinki. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us at TVP World.
Good afternoon.
Lovely location there. Well, thank you for joining us. So we have this lovely Russian announcement, another threat of escalation, provocation. Before we get into the maritime details, I wanted to ask you about Gotland, that Swedish island in the Baltic Sea, because that is also of great significance. We hear from the top Swedish military commander that whoever controls Gotland essentially really is sort of in the Baltic Sea, and we hear that Putin really does aim to control the Baltic Sea, and he has a very keen eye on the island as well, and really redrawing these maritime borders and him getting his hands on Gotland is the end of peace in the Nordics and in the Scandinavian countries. How much of a threat are we looking at really in terms of Russian aggression in that region?
Well, there are many general tensions and various incidents have taken place. Now, whether this today's big news about Russia's plans to change some of the maritime borders affect the security system and how radically, there's a lot of unclarity about that. It seems the Russians took away their plan from the website where it was discovered, and there's very little information on what it would mean in practice, whether it is, as some say, a routine assessment of borders, whether it's part of hybrid operation, and whether it's a serious claim to take more territorial waters to Russia. And honestly, we don't know so much about that. I haven't seen any particular reports on how that would affect the island of Gotland in particular. But Gotland, as you said, is obviously a key strategic place on the Baltic, like Åland Islands between Finland and Sweden.
So obviously this is a provocation at this point, but how should the countries of the Baltic Sea be proactive at this point to, I guess, prevent any further provocation in these regards?
That's for the politicians to decide. It seems now the two countries most directly affected, Finland and Lithuania. The leaders have taken a little bit different approach. In Lithuania, it seems the government wants to talk to the Russian ambassador and has taken a more outspoken line against what they perceive as at least a hybrid aggression, whereas the Finnish government and president have taken a little bit more tranquil approach, like saying, okay, let's see what the facts are and whether it is a provocation or not. And also keeping the possibility that it's a more of a routine act, and there's this old saying in Finland by an ex-president, like, let's not be provoked when others try to provoke us. And I think they are applying a little bit that kind of philosophy there. Which approach is better is not really for me to say, but there's a difference between Lithuania and Finland right now.
There's the issue of these nautical charts that the Defense Ministry has referred to, mentioning that the earlier Soviet measurements of the borders in 1985 are not, they're not accurate, they're not relevant, they don't correspond to the modern cartographical coordinates. From a legal perspective and from a practical perspective, if these changes were to be implemented, and obviously Russia doesn't necessarily abide by international law, how would this even be? How would these changes even be implemented?
Well, as to what I understand and have listened to experts on maritime border law, there is a difference between something they would call a more technical sort of revision of the coordinates, and then something that clearly aims and ends up in conquering more territory to the country in question, in this case Russia. And honestly, we don't know yet what this exactly is about, because the details have not been made public. So in case there is a move that would imply territorial adjustment that also affects neighboring countries, that then of course there are legal procedures in maritime law and in international law more generally that need to be followed, and unilateral declaration or proposal by Russia would of course not be valid according to international law. But we are not sure yet what this actually implies.
In the meantime, should there be an increased naval presence along the current understandings of what the borders are recognized as and what the borders seem to be at present?
I think there are some debates around that in Finland. We've seen commentaries by some foreign policy experts who say that now is the time Finland, together with NATO, to go and show our presence in the waters that might be under dispute. Others are calling for more sort of tranquil approach, and let's just look at what's happening. It's obvious that there's some sort of awareness of the possible tensions that might come out of it in all quarters and headquarters, both military and politicians. But nothing. No major maneuvers have been taken or decided, as far as I know.
Do you think that some discussions might emerge that perhaps the Baltic Sea has, focus has been diminished, or there hasn't been enough focus on that as space in light of recent Russian activities, that all the focus has been on land, maybe air, and not enough on sea?
Yes, there's some awareness of that, because like in Finland, there's been a lot of debate about the eastern land border with Russia and what to do with that. So the maritime border has been given less attention. Of course, historically for Russia, the maritime routes have been very important, both this one through the Baltics and then through the Turkish straits historically. And one possible context for the announcement, if it's a provocation or kind of tit for tat, like show off thing from Russia, is that recently there's been various kinds of conversation on how to restrict Russian or those so-called shadow tankers, oil tankers that are importing and exporting materials, mostly oil, from Russia and go through the Baltics and the Danish straits. And both Finnish foreign minister and recently, for example, British authorities were discussing how to restrict Russians' possibilities to use these oil tankers, and that might be something that the Russians might want to respond to and say, look, if you want to restrict our ability to move in the Baltic Sea, we also have a couple of tricks in our sleeves, and this might be one of them. That's one possible interpretation of what Russians are aiming for, but honestly, we don't know what their motives are.
Well, and you raise a very interesting point. What could the countries of NATO do to, in fact, limit the transport of Russian oil, or try and cut off some of those ships due to the sanctions in the Baltic Sea? What could we really do about that?
Well, it seems it's a dilemma that many authorities are thinking about. Now, the focus have been on the part of the Baltic that connects the Baltic Sea with the Atlantic Sea and the North Sea, and there Denmark plays an important role. And there's this whole legal and political debate about to what extent it's advisable to search or stop and search tankers, and how much that could be seen as a provocation, and how much that is according to against some laws of maritime traffic that in principle are not so political, and what are their implications for the ongoing conflict where there's fear of escalation in tensions with Russia in the West. So this is a huge debate right now, and whether or not Russia has intended this plan, revealing this plan to revise some of the maritime borders as a response to that debate, it's clear that that debate provides one context in which the Russian plan arrives, whether or not it was intended.
And one last question in terms of Russia's maritime presence in the context of what we're speaking about now. How far would Russia have to go to consider it an attack on the NATO alliance?
You mean how far should Russia go before NATO considers an attack?
Yes.
I don't know. But it's not been tested so much. There's this whole game going on, like where we are seeing speculations about how far Russia might go. Of course, in Poland, there's this fear of some kind of territorial violations, whether by drones or some other flying material. And in Finland, there's something similar, and there's all kinds of psychological tension going on where Russia and perhaps even both sides might be testing the other side's reaction, but it's hard to predict how far Russia would go and where the exact red line for something like Fifth Article of NATO to be applied lies. So it's a huge question, actually a question about the future of humanity in some sense.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'm sure these provocations will continue, and we will definitely be having you to join us here on this channel when and if they do. Teivo Teivainen, Professor of World Politics at University of Helsinki. Thank you.